Well, I'm grateful to be with you today. My wife wanted me to tell you that normally I don't look like this. I've been going to the dermatologist and dealing with skin cancer on my face, and usually I look worse, I guess. But anyway, in case you get really close, you go, oh, that's really bad. He needs a dermatologist. I have one. So anyway, if you have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 14. I am grateful to be with you today, and there's a lot of connections to this church over the years. I got to speak with you last year. Even some of your elders used to be in church with me before. And so, Mullins, sorry to call you out. But anyway, and so there's just a lot of connections. Some of you remember Travis Akins, who was a youth minister for a while. He was baptized at the church where we were. And he's doing great things up in Oklahoma now. And there's just a lot of different connections. I better stop because I'm going to leave somebody out. So anyway, I want to start tonight by telling you about something that I just did. So in 2019, I got to go to the Holy Lands with a trip that Harding put together, and Monty Cox, who's the Dean of Bible, was kind of putting it together. And at that point, when we finished in 2019, I said, can you take a trip to Egypt? And he said, yes, but not yet. And he said, but I'm taking a trip to Turkey to Seventh Church of Asia. And so I signed up immediately in 2019 and paid for the last 3 years. And I just got back from there. And so if I fall asleep, that's what it is. So what's going on there, but got to go to the 7 churches of Asia, along with a couple of the churches that Paul visited and one that Peter had been to. And so one of the things that we did is one of our elders at Mansfield is also a travel agent, and he went with us in 2019, even though I wasn't at that church at the time, and he went with us this time, and he said, hey, let's get there early. Let's go to Zurich for 4 or 5 days, and so that we're adjusted to the time zone, and then we'll go to Istanbul, and so that's what we did. And so we were in Zurich for 4 days, actually 5, and just to kind of throw things, I was without my luggage the whole time. But anyway, that's a whole other story. And so we were in Zurich, and he had planned this. He said, hey, there's going to be this night, and you're going to go with me to this restaurant. And so Debbie and I were excited, but he wouldn't tell us anything about it. And so we take our Uber from our hotel, which, by the way, was the Chocolate Hotel. I'd recommend it. Anyway, we take our Uber from there to this restaurant, and we show up, and there's this cow outside. It's obviously an old Methodist church, and the cow's painted funny colors. And we look at it, and I'm looking at the Dutch there, and it looks like it says kind of a blind cow. And I said, what's the name of this? And he goes, oh, it's called Blind Cow. And I said, oh, it's great. And they said, interpreted into English, it's really a blind man's bluff, a children's game. And so we walk into this, and there's a foyer, and they said, give us your watches and your phones. And so they said, anything else that reflects. And so we gave it to them. They locked it in the locker. And they said, okay, if you need to look at a menu, you can. We'd recommend that you just trust your waiter. And we said, all right. And he said, all right, if you haven't experienced this yet, you're going to be eating in the dark. And so we got together, and we put our hands on the person in front of us. Our waiter, Sean, came out, which spoke 5 languages. And Sean was completely blind, and Sean said, follow me and I will seat you. And so we go through our first set of curtains, and it's a little bit dark. We go through another set of curtains, almost completely dark. Then we go to the dining room. And there's 75 people in there eating. We're all at different tables. We're at our table. We sit down. You can't see anything. After a while, I just shut my eyes because it was easier than trying to stare and see something. And our waiter took care of everything. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced anything like that. It wouldn't pass here because of all of our disability and OSHA regulations, but it did in Zurich. And the reason they do it is to try to help you understand people with disabilities, and also to give jobs to people with disabilities. And so it's really unique. So we're sitting down, and you have to feel for everything, right? And you do not know what it is. And I said, hey, I can't eat gluten. He says, fine, I'll take care of you. So I didn't even know what I was getting to eat. And he puts your shoulder, and he puts it down in front of me, and you're feeling around, and you have to pour your water glass, and you can't do it. My wife sticks her finger in it so she knows how full it is, right? And the guy next to me, Ken, is eating with his fingers because he can't find his silverware. Partway through the meal, Danielle, who's sitting across from me, somebody takes her water glass. You can't find it anywhere. We think we're almost finished. And my fear is that I'm going to spill it on myself, right? And I've tucked I just went ahead and said, nobody can see, so I tucked my napkin into my shirt. and I'm eating, but I realize that I'm leaning over more and more the whole time. I know that if somebody had taken a picture, I think I would have been like this when I was eating. So one of the great things was the guy next to me, Ken, said, "Wow, I thought I was finished. I just found a whole other corner of my plate." There's more food. And so we eat it. We even enjoy dessert and even coffee, which was, anyway, but completely in the dark. And so finally we leave and we put our hands on our shoulders and we said, "How long was that?" And they said, "Oh, you were average." And I said, "Oh, we were here 45 minutes?" They said, "No, you were here 2 hours and 15 minutes. Okay? Here's one of the things that you learn is you're much more attentive to conversation. You engage people that you normally wouldn't engage, right? You pay attention to the texture and the taste of food more. So we left there. The reason, though, I bring that up is because I think in our world, that's often the way we approach following Jesus. Is that what we realize is when it comes to counting the cost, go ahead and go to the next slide. Sorry, we ought to be 2 in. So next one, I think. Can we go? All right, great. So that was the Blind Cow in Zurich. By the way, there are 12 restaurants like that. There are only 2 called the Blind Cow. If you get a chance to experience it, great. You just have to go overseas because we don't let it happen here. But it would be good for you to experience. But I think that meal, I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea. But I sat there and I experienced something that I never would experience anymore. Go ahead and go to the next slide, because I think what we realize is you can't see in the dark, right? Most of us think we can because we get up in the middle of the night, but there's a light on someplace, or we've been very familiar. So when Debbie and I were moving back from Searcy to live back in Mansfield, we lived with a family for 3 months until their house sold, and then we lived in hotels, different hotels for a while, and then we finally found a rental house. And so one night we'd been living in Mansfield for about 5 months, and we'd been in 10 different beds. And Debbie wakes up in the middle of the night and she goes, "I don't know where I am. Where are we?" You can't see in the dark. But I think when it comes to following Jesus, what most of us are is we're sitting there going, "I didn't really understand what I was getting into," right? I had no idea what this life was going to be following him and where we're going to be. And so let me tell you about the neighborhood I lived in Searcy right before I moved here. This was a house that was 3 houses over from mine. 102 Golf Course Drive. And my house kind of sit behind it. You just can't see it here. This we called the castle in our neighborhood. So the guy living directly across the street, which you can almost see in this backyard, just knew that he was just going to get this big, he was selling his company, going to get this huge tax dividend and a payoff, and he started building the house. And so when he started building it, he was excited about it, but partway through the sell, the company goes under, he runs out of money. This house had 4 owners before somebody moved into it. Because everybody that bought it thought, I can put the rest into it, and I can flip it, or I can live here. 4 different people bought this house, never living in it. And around town, it was a joke for us, because the saying was, the old country saying, don't count your chickens before they hatch, right? So finally, the 5th person that owned it was a friend of mine from high school, and he came down and he finished it out, and then he resold it, and then people live in it now. But the first 4 didn't count the cost for what it meant to own this house, the castle. By the way, it's 4 floors, if you can't tell, and it's got 6 garages. It's huge. But most of the people I know, when it comes to following Christ, have never counted the cost for what it means to follow Jesus Christ. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to look at. One is there's a cost to following God. There really is. But usually we're so excited to get somebody in the water, so excited for somebody to profess their faith, that we don't always talk about this idea of counting the cost. I found that in church planting, a lot of churches don't even talk about expectations for membership, expectations for following Jesus. And so we've often missed out on those opportunities to tell people, hey, there's a cost. If you ask my sons, I've told them before they ever became Christians that there is a cost of following God. And I've told them in your lifetime you will see hardship because of following Christ. You need to know that before you ever sign up for it. Now, there's no way we can predict everything, right? But we have to be aware that there is a cost of following Christ, and it often is more expensive than we think it is. Our problem is we have false expectations for what it means to follow Christ. Okay? And I'll just tell you, I think we really found that out. Some of the scholars of our time have written about the government shutdown of 2020, and they've called it the Great Sifting. Okay? You can call it whatever you want. But the idea is most of the people I know that follow Christ, it's more of, it's more lip service than actually following, because there's not a investment except for professing his name. And so we've missed out on this idea. We have these false expectations because a lot of people I'm talking to in our community say they treat Jesus more like a genie than like a savior. Or they treat him more like a savior than like a king. And I think we've missed out on the idea of what he calls us to. You see, we don't understand discipleship. We understand Christianity better than discipleship. And what God calls to, because discipleship is about learning. It's about being so close to Jesus that the dirt from his feet gets on our clothes. And so sometimes we miss this idea of what it means to really follow him. And that's what Jesus began to tell us in Luke chapter 14. All these crowds are following him. He goes, there's too many people. Not because there's too many people, because he knows they're coming for the things rather than for the Lord. They're coming because they want the stuff answered by prayers than for really following him and understanding eternal life with him. And so he tells some really hard things in this parable today. I think what we're going to have to look at as we get into the text is there are questions to be answered. So I'm reading from today's English version, and we're going to read Luke 14, verses 25 through following, through the end of the chapter. This is the way it reads. Now large crowds were accompanying Jesus. And they returned unto him, and he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, wanting to build a tower, doesn't sit down first and compute the cost, and how if they'll have enough money to even complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation, he will not have enough to finish the tower, and everyone will see that he had begun, but one is able to finish, and so they'll make fun of him. They will say, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king is going out to confront another king in battle, who will not sit down first and determine whether he even has 10,000 troops opposed to the one coming against him with 20,000 troops? If he cannot succeed, he will first send a representative with the others while still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. In the same way, therefore, can't you be a disciple if you don't renounce all of your own possessions? You see, salt is good, but if salt loses its savor or its flavor, how can it be flavorful again or even be restored? If there is no value for the soil or for the manure pile, it should just be thrown out. The one who has ears to hear needs to listen. The question is Jesus seated on the throne of your heart? That's what he's asking. This old idea of hating, it just means love less, right? In that section. It's not that you actually hate, it's that you love these things less than you love Jesus. And I know it's easy for us as Americans to say we love Jesus, but when we look at our Google calendars and our bank accounts and all that kind of stuff, it's hard to say that, yes, we do love Jesus. Because it seems like we love our things more than we love him. It seems like that we sit on the throne more than he sits on the throne of our heart. And what he's saying is, he's asking this question, and the question needs to be answered, is Jesus sitting on the throne of your heart? That's what it's all about, these three parables. Have you counted the cost, and who is in control of your life? Who really sits there? Or maybe he's asking, do you love everything else less? Do you love everything else less? Because on Sunday I profess him, but on Monday it's often about me. Because Wednesday night I might sing his praises, but on Thursday it might be about making money in other relationships. And I'm not trying to be condescending about what's going on. I think what Jesus wants us to know is he's just asking a simple question. what is most important in our life? What is really most important? That's his question. Who do you love most? And can we see it? Can we really see it? You see, there is an answer to discipleship that he calls us to. He said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to follow. And the answer, I think there's two things here, the answer for us. One is Jesus is worth it. I know those things look good, and I know those relationships look good, and I know yourself looks good, and I know what you have looks good, but Jesus is worth it. So when we were in Turkey, our guide was talking to us. He was a secular Muslim. He knew a great deal about Christianity, so close to being a believer, but he was telling us about his friend. When we went out to Cappadocia, we were 200 miles from Syria and Iraq and Iran and Armenia. His friend was down on the border, and ISIS crossed over into Turkey. And his friend was a believer in Jesus and was an archaeologist. And ISIS showed up, and this would be 4 weeks ago now. ISIS showed up and said, we want you to renounce Jesus, and we want the things that you're digging up. And he said, I will not do either one of those. And for the next week, ISIS killed his family, and they tortured him and finally took his life. We don't face persecution. We face inconvenience. But here's somebody that understood that Jesus is worth it. Because the things here only last for a short time. And it's not the things of God last for. I've never been like that. I get upset when I'm inconvenienced. I get upset, by the way, if more than 4 people are in front of me at Chick-fil-A. Right? But I wonder if we really believe Jesus is worth it. Because it looks to me like we sacrifice everything for our own selves and very little for God. In fact, usually what gets sacrificed is God's time rather than our own, just to be honest. It's very rare for us to say, I want to be your disciple, and I want to make disciples that make disciples. Because that's what following God is all about. And then the last part of the question is you got to stay salty. You just got to stay salty. That's what God calls you to be. That's what makes a difference in our world, is staying salty. And I think that the longer we are away from our conversion, the less salty sometimes we are. Less we're more likely to share our stories of what God has done and the stories of our conversion in our life. Because God is powerful and He does great things, but if we keep our stories to ourselves, nobody knows what God can do. At least not as clear. If we forget that God changed our lives to share it with others, then maybe in some ways we take the power, not that He's not powerful, but He doesn't use us. And so God calls us to stay salty. Because without it, it's worthless. So some of you may have heard of the Marble Hill nuclear power plant. I don't know if you have or not. It was started in 1977. That's a picture of it. It was, at 1977 is when they started. In 1984 is when they stopped construction on it. It was only half finished. They'd spent $2.6 billion on it. Just recently it was torn down. Never, ever used for what it was built for. $2.6 billion built for those years, built to provide power to the state of Indiana, and it never did. One would say that Indiana Power Electric, that later became Duke Electric, didn't count the cost for building the power plant, and that may be true because it changed hands a couple times. But I think the saddest story to me about this is that it never fulfilled what it was built for. I think what this parable says to us is, you have something you were built for. Do you fulfill it? God made you to be salty. God made you to be a disciple. And he wants you to tell others. You got to count the cost, but he calls you for that. You see, what God calls us to is to count the cost. Go ahead and count the cost for what it means. And I don't know that sometimes we don't do a disservice to anybody that's starting to follow him without saying, count the cost. This is going to cost you some relationships. This is going to change how you live. I had a friend named Randy that came to know who Christ was. Randy's mom was a drug dealer in the town I grew up in, and he became a Christian. It was great. Randy still follows Christ. But when Randy became a Christian, he had to move out from his mom because she was the drug dealer. He said, I can't be around that anymore. And then Randy went and he burned all of his albums. Now, I know albums dates me, but I don't think anybody here, I think they all know what they are. When I talk to my college students, they're like, what's that? I said, vinyl. But they said, what's that? Anyway, but he went and burned them. And I said, no, not the Great White. But anyway, he burned them all, right? And I said, Randy, why did you do that? He said, because if I'm a follower of Jesus, I need to get rid of everything that reminds me of my own life. This is the cost to following Jesus. Not my cost, his cost. And he never went back to that lifestyle. Never went back to those drugs. And he was a witness to his mom to her death. What's the cost? Can you count the cost? What God calls you to. Not that he has to have all your stuff, but that he's the owner of it. Not that you have to give him everything, but you always know that he is the Lord. That he sits on your heart, on the throne of your heart. Last story before we close is, I have a friend named Paul. Paul and I grew up together. He's 10 years older than I am, but he spent tons of years as a missionary in Cameroon, Africa. Paul was talking to, one of the things they face in Cameroon, Africa is, and by the way, our church has a couple Cameroonians in it now because of that connection. But Paul, one of the things that they talk about when somebody's coming to know Christ is he says, you got to count the cost. He said, because we have people that are involved in multi-marriages, like polygamists, all that kind of stuff. He said, most of them are into witchcraft and those kinds of things and spiritualism. And so he says, we have to count the cost. And so he was talking in one of his villages. They were talking about following Christ. And there was a woman who was pregnant. And she said, I want to follow Christ. And he said, that's awesome. You've counted the cost. She said, yes, I understand that I may give it up all my relationships. And he said, all right, great. She said, I'm ready to be baptized. He said, awesome. She said, I want to be baptized right there. And she pointed to this river, and the river had a deep spot in it, and that river was known to be inhabited by the ancestors and all the witchcraft and all that. That's where they did divinations and all that kind of stuff. And Paul said, can we do it someplace else? And she said, no, because if Jesus is Lord, then that's where I need to do it and leave all my past. And Paul was really worried. He said, because she's pregnant, and if she's baptized in that water and the baby comes out anything other than perfect, everybody in that village would say, see, we told you Jesus is Lord. And so Paul says to her one more time, have you counted the cost? She said, yes, I have. I'm willing to leave everything. And they went down to that hole in Cameroon, Africa, and she was baptized in that water. And Paul said, for the next 3 months, I held my breath. What would that baby look like? He said, everybody in our church was praying that that baby would be perfect. He said, sure enough, after 3 months, that baby was born, and it was perfect. And the whole town came to know Jesus. Because Jesus is Lord, and he's worth it. Because he has the power over the demons that they served. You can do with that story what you want. It's amazing when people count the cost, what they can do, because we can count the cost because Jesus Christ is Lord. He's worth it. I don't know where you stand today. I don't know what you're dealing with. I know that probably all of us brought something in here that we're dealing with that we haven't shared with somebody else. I think what we need to do is, as we look at this text from Luke chapter 14, is ask the question, maybe you approached Christianity in the dark, completely and you're fumbling your way through it and just trying to figure it out and never really counted the cost. It's okay. He'll still see you through it. There's still somebody there to guide you through it. Jesus constantly was around the blind and said, I'm the light. Follow me. It's okay. Most of us are followers of Christ. Our problem is we're still not counting the cost always. We're not telling others. Our biggest deal is we're forgotten to be salty, right? Because it's real easy to forget that Jesus is meant to sit on the throne. So may we walk out of this place and be challenged to tell everyone in one way or another that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he makes a difference, and it is worth it.